How's it going, YouTube? The fall season's finally coming to an end, and if you're like me, you're starting to think about the ice fishing season that's coming up. Today we're going to be talking about dead sticking, float fishing, and tip-up setups. Why you should use a dead stick, float, or tip-up setup on ice fishing. I use a dead stick or a float as a second attempt at catching fish that might not want the jigging presentation. So usually what happens is you have a dead stick hole and a jigging hole, and you're calling fish in using that jigging presentation. But what happens is the fish get closer in, they see how erratically the bait's moving, and they may not want to do that because they're a little more lethargic. So the dead stick is just your second attempt at catching that same fish you just already called in. Whereas tip-ups, I'm using them on hotspots I've already previously fished from that day, or using them as a preliminary attack on fish that might be moving around throughout the area. So let's start off with the dead sticking setup. Currently I'm using a Bay tip dip light action 40-inch for my rod. And I'm using the Akuma Samar live bait reel in a 500 series with 8-pound fluorocarbon as my main line. The hook setup is pretty straightforward. It's just a plain hook with a slip sinker with the beads and a stopper on it, and then attached to a swivel, and then another line stopper. So there's two reasons why I like using the Bay tip dip. For one, it's got a super soft bite indication tip that is fluorescent orange, so it doesn't get blended in with the snow around the background. The other thing is having that 40-inch length allows me to put a hole a little further away from my main jigging hole. That way I'm not tangling up my live bait to my jigging rod or whatnot. So I prefer to use a slip sinker over a split shot, and the reason for that is I find that split shots can crimp or kink your line, which can cause a breakage when landing a fish. The other nice thing about using a slip sinker is you can adjust how far your weight sits from your hook. So if you find fish are aggressive and they're willing to chase, having that weight higher up will make the bait fish have more room to pendulum from the weight. If you find the fish are lethargic, you can pull that weight down, and that hook and bait will not pendulum as far away, so it'll give the fish more time to hone in on where the bait is. So when I'm using a slip sinker, I prefer to use a little bit heavier of a slip sinker. This is, I think, a 1/8 ounce slip sinker. The reason for that is when this bait is down in the water, it'll bend the tip just a little bit, so I know that there's always a little bit of tension here. That way, if I do happen to see any upbites, I can tell by the rod itself. So you can see that this is free floating with just the weight. As soon as I put any little pressure of it going up, that rod blank straightens right out. That way I know I can tell if I have any upbites or if it decides to pull it down. The other reason why I use a heavier slip sinker is for the live bait reel itself. So you have the switch in the back here, which activates your second drag on the bottom. And having that heavier slip sinker will cause your reel to free spool a little bit nicer, so the fish doesn't notice as much tension from the rod and the line itself. So having a little bit extra weight will cause it to spin a little bit easier without putting too much rod tension on your tip. The other thing I like to do with my dead sticks is I tie another string stopper to where I set my depth at. So that way when I'm dropping down after catching a fish or moving places, I know exactly how far my line has to be in the water, so I know where my depth is. So that's what we're talking about, is a slip float rig for winter. As for the rod reel itself, it doesn't matter what you use, which is whatever you're most comfortable with. This is a thermal ice medium light action from Fishing 13. It's a combo setup. The hook and float itself is pretty much the exact same thing you'd do for summertime. You're just going to use a number 6 or whatever size you want to use octopus hook with a slip sinker, line tie attached to the swivel. And usually you're using a smaller swivel, so I put a bead there so the swivel doesn't get stuck inside your bobber. Then you got your actual slip float, and then another bead with your line tie to stop it from going past where you want it to set. The last thing we're going to be talking about is a tip-up setup. So I'm just using a HT big game tip-up. So pretty standard. You got your flag, got your post with the spool. It's pretty self-explanatory. So this is how I like to set up my tip-ups. I prefer to use a spoon of some sort. This is an eyeball spoon from Northland Tackle. You can use a smaller Castmaster or a dinner bell, one of the smaller size dinner bells from Frostbite. I like using a spoon because as the bait fish swims around, it's going to cause a little bit of flash and a little bit of rattle every time that bait fish swims away. So from your spoon, you're going to have about 3 feet of fluorocarbon, and then attached to a swivel, attached to your background main line, and then a bullet sinker to get past any slush and to just get your bait down faster. And then I also use a bobber stop on my main line, so that way when I'm moving my tip-ups around, I can adjust the height and depth where I want to be, use this as my guide to set up where my depth should be on the water line, and I know I'm always in the same depth at every spot I go to. So when do you use a dead stick? I prefer to use a dead stick when I'm running gunning, that way I can have my 2 holes already punched, have one for jigging, one for dead sticking. I can grab this rod quickly, drop it down the hole, have it sitting there while I jig the second hole. If I find fish aren't in the area, then I can quickly reel this back up and get moving to a different location. So when to use a slip float? I use a slip float when I'm already on fish and I have the hub shelter set up in the location where the fish are. The nice thing about using a slip float setup inside the shelter is that you're usually using a smaller rod. So you can either have it on the ground directly above the float, or what I like to do is I like to hang it up from the roof ribs of your shelter and have that line all the way perfectly down with the bail open. That way the fish can take the line as far as it wants to go without noticing any resistance. So last thing is, when do you use a tip-up? I normally use tip-ups in between locations when running gunning. So for instance, let's say you were at a hole, there was fish, you're marking them, you're catching the odd one. The hole is kind of still hot, but you don't necessarily want to leave it yet. That's when I pull a tip-up up, because I can throw it on top of the hole and leave it there and go to a different location and search for other fish. If I happen to see the flag come up, then I know that the fish are still in that area, and I can still potentially use that as a spot to fish from. So you might be wondering what hooks you use on a dead stick, slip float, or tip-up setup. Personally for me, when I'm using a dead stick or a float, it's usually going to be either a plain hook or a small tungsten jig, because I'm going to be closer to those rods. I'm going to be able to jig them and move them when a fish is nearby. The only time I change that is when I'm using a tip-up, because I'm not going to be able to move the tip-up all that much. I like to use a smaller size spoon for that. So here's a couple spoons that I normally use. The first one being a Acme Castmaster rattle spoon. The next would be a Northland Tackle eyeball spoon. And the last is a small dinner bell spoon from Frostbite Tackle. The reason why I use spoons on tip-ups is because I'm not going to be near the bait, or I'm not going to be near the tip-up itself. So the bait fish on the spoon will create rattle and flash to bring fish in. So hopefully this video helped you understand dead stick floats and tip-ups for ice season, and I'll catch you guys later.